So I do want to put a little bit of a disclaimer when I was deciding responsive readings and sections to cite. I did try to learn from the best and went to my dad for a little bit of help, and he challenged me to try to do this on my own, so-called without training wheels. And so I, just like he taught me how to ride a bicycle. And so you might be seeing a few scrapes and bruises, I'll just say that. But this did provide me an opportunity to go through Singing the Living Tradition again, which has always been, as an adult, a great experience, since this is a book that I've been rifling through the pages since I was a small child, and decided that since the responsive reading was something from a more Judeo-Christian tradition, I wanted to find something outside of that. And so I stumbled upon 609 in Singing the Living Tradition, which is written by an Islamic scholar, and it is on the topic of serving people. And it starts, to worship God is nothing other than to serve the people. It does not need rosaries, prayer, carpet, or robes. All peoples are members of the same body, created from one essence. And if fate brings suffering to one member, the others cannot stay at rest. You'll also find that brevity ended up becoming an asset to me as I learned without training wheels. And so please enjoy the next section of your music, another song that's been a large part of my childhood, and enjoy.
My life flows on in endless song of others' lamentation. I hear the river far off him that tells a new creation. Above the tumult and the strife, I
first want to thank Carol Koistra and the Religious Services Committee for their invitation to participate in this very special summer session, or as I called it as a child, Open Mic Sunday. On this, the 50th anniversary of Fountain Street, I found it I found it quite special to be invited because this has been a place that's been a second home for me for almost 15 years. When my family moved here in 2005, many of you accepted a moody 14-year-old with pimples and long greasy hair with open arms, and for that I'm always grateful. In fact, I'm just going to go off on one quick tangent. Last or 2 Sundays ago, I recall going into the social hall, and a fountain clubber asked if I was interested in purchasing a diversity steak, emphasizing that they were made from Fountain Club. And Patty Johnson was right behind me cackling because she had memories of me painting those diversity steaks and being awful at it and not coping well with it. So thank you to all of you. Thank you to those who have adopted me into this second home for this decade and a half. As we get started, I do want to share a disclaimer. Politicians do not always make good pastors. Especially in the world of 140 character limits, 15-second digital ads, and 2-minute canvassing stump speeches. The idea of spending more than a few minutes on a topic to explore it deeply and spiritually is a tad daunting for me. Like I mentioned, bruises and cuts, no training wheels. And so I'm just going to put that disclaimer out of the way. I chose to speak about my struggle as a religious liberal, as my career in politics, and a believer in the separation of church and state. These are both very major personal identities of mine, and this conflict has always defined a large part of my spiritual life. I also felt it would be appropriate to speak on this topic because we are in Pride Month, and my opinions on this issue stem from the struggle of our LGBT loved ones being treated as second-class citizens for so long and remain in danger of discrimination. I remember in 2003 when then President Bush called for an amendment to our United States Constitution to ban same-sex marriage. Coincidentally, it was the first time I read on my own our founding documents in school. I remember reading, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." And then I struggled to see how these principles matched with the values of my leaders calling for legal discrimination. So it was at the same period in my life that I was introduced to the reason for this discrepancy, the political arm of the religious right. I learned of Falwell, Hagee, and Robertson and the moral majority. I saw the influence created in this country over decades of organizing and not compromising, of cultivating this influence in every level of government. I could not help but feel this was inherently wrong. After all, this network was created in large part to treat LGBT folk, women, people of color, and anyone who did not fit their mold for a perfect person. Now, at this same time, I became increasingly active within the youth organization of the Unitarian Universalist Association, largely as a way to keep in touch with longtime friends from Brooklyn when we moved here. Much of this youth organization focused on political activism. While this was something I increasingly enjoyed being a part of, I could not help but feel we were hypocritical. How could we be political while calling the religious right to stay out? And so this is something, I posed this question of a minister who was an adult leader within the youth organization, and hoping to hear something profound and thoughtful, the response was a very terse, "Because we're right." I will admit, even though from the deeper side of me, something very guttural, I felt that he was correct, it did leave something longing in me, especially since I could not help but feel something similar was being said by those within the other camp, so to speak. So I was compelled to find some other answer to this question. For a long time, that answer was simply not to let one aspect of my life mesh with the other. I felt that rationalized morality, free from spirituality, must be the only way to operate in politics. So much like in 2013 or 2003, I'm now making myself even younger than I look. Much like in 2003, as a middle schooler, I found myself reading our nation's founding documents. It was at this point in my life that I began my university education, which took me to read some of our original secular moralists. And in between my nightly routine of banging my head against the walls of my dorm, wondering what on earth these old, peculiar men were meant by their writing, I also began to wonder if these were in fact the guides to morality and politics without spirituality. Was Socrates right that morality in politics is the giving up of one's hopes, personal hopes and satisfaction in favor of a common good, and doing what is best fitting to the individual's natural gifts? Was Machiavelli correct that morality cannot be the rationale for any political decision, as it could expose the body politic to abuse and tyranny? Perhaps the most daunting was Kant's categorical imperative, which he described as act as if the maxims of your actions were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. You can imagine reading this as a new 21-year-old, and then pondering the decision of spending the evening at the bar or studying could have universal ramifications. Each of these arguments, while illuminating, still left something to be desired in this context. Certainly, these great thinkers spent more time and devoted more brain cells to the thought of morality than me, but to me it raised the question, can someone who is both a religious liberal and a political liberal truly have separate consciences, almost separate beings? Character and conscience is so much like a fluid or a gas, in the fact that it takes so much effort to contain and is guaranteed to fail eventually. This idea that someone who is religious and whose faith directs much of their life must place a key part of their life in a lockbox is simply not doable. While there may be a need for the separation of church and state, there may not be a way to separate religion from politics. The belief in whether or not communities of worship had a role in politics is actually a recurring argument in my marriage. Most couples argue over chores. We debate the merits of exclusion or inclusion in activism. Don't worry, we argue over chores too. But my wife is both a liberal and a Calvin College alumna. It took me a minute to figure out how that worked too when we first started dating. But two identities that she sees influencing each other. And I'm not going to delve more into how that's true, or else the DeVosses and the Princes may just shut down the school. Well, my brilliant spouse suggested that I find a new thinker to read from, a modern professor of theology at Yale Divinity School by the name of Miroslav Volf. Himself a Christian, he felt that there was a need to acknowledge Christianity and religion's new role in a pluralistic, democratic society. His sentiment was that we need to have both religious-friendly democracies and democracy-friendly religions. He stresses that the past of where religion, particularly one religion, dominated culture to the point that it and the state were one in the same, became a source for violence and not something worth returning to. In his book, A Public Faith, Wolf penned a passage that I found fairly profound. While it pertains to mainline Christianity, I do find it applicable to this discussion and this house of worship. He says the cure against Christian violence is not less of the Christian faith, but in a carefully qualified sense, more of the Christian faith. I don't mean, of course, that the cure against violence lies in increased religious zeal. Blind religious zeal is part of the problem. Instead, it lies in stronger and more intelligent commitment to the Christian faith as faith. So in the context of my own internal struggle, I read this as the acceptance of faith in political discourse, because politics is not a vacuum of texts, of writings, of messages, of books, but in people. If people are inherently spiritual, then spirituality will certainly enter politics. And if that is the case, then it needs to have a proper role in a pluralistic society, a role that does not exert violence. And I should note that, for me, this goes beyond physical violence, but the violence caused by sanctioning of second-class citizenship because of the interpretation of ancient law that also sanctions slavery and capital punishment. And so it is possible that the terse answer I received as a teenager was correct. Well, not precisely. Yes, if we accept that religion will enter into politics, we as religious liberals must take our role in it. Much like my father noted last week, and he warned me he might talk about the same subject, we as religious liberals have a duty to be in the space of patriotism and so politics to show that there is an alternative, but to also not cede this ground to those who may urge violence and injustice. But moreover, we must have a space in this because there are people who are in this cause who have yet to find their spiritual home. And there are those for whom the cause of justice is their closest connection to the divine. You all may have wondered why I chose the responsive reading. I will admit, part of it comes from my own humor. I thought the irony of the minister's son stating, "I hate, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies," and then going on about fatted animals was too hard not to pass. The larger part of it, though, was the ending. But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. As I noted in my bio to the church, I struggled with my spirituality as a child. I do believe part of that was spirituality and religion was a part of my family's job. But nevertheless, the ceremony associated with any spiritual tradition proved difficult for me to connect to. But the more I reflect upon my own spiritual journey, the more I see how it is my own political journey that I find myself more connected to something greater than myself. I see that it is through activism, through service, through the human and imperfect pursuit of justice that I feel most connected to the divine, and I have a feeling that that is something shared in this room and people who have yet to find this room. And so we owe it upon ourselves to find our space in the separation of church and state, in this role of politics. We owe it to show that there are those who possess faith, and that faith tells them to be compassionate, just, and caring. We owe it to those who crave a spiritual family, but whose experience is with those who crave control over inspiration. We owe it to those for whom the cause of justice is the most spiritual journey they can take. We owe it to ourselves to find this space. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephen. All right, and now I invite you all to stand as you're able and join in one voice as we sing hymn number 140, Hail the Glorious Golden City. My friends, may the longtime sun shine upon you. May the all love surround you. And may the pure light within you guide your way. Go forth in sunny solstice blessings, my friends. Amen.